Friends, Lori here. I'm back. I'm here to film my top fantasy reads of the year. There is 10 books on this list. They all are YA, which is just normally like the most genre I read is probably YA fantasy. I would probably have to do math. It's probably like pretty even, but I tend to like fantasy books a lot more because there tends to be like a lot more to the story. There tends to always be a mystery element. There tends to be a romance. There tends to be fun worlds. So I tend to read a lot of YA fantasy, and that is why most of these books have made this list. For some weird miracle, I also have most of these books to chat about like physically, which I never actually have. So let's get into it. The first book I'm going to chat about is actually one of the first books I read this year, and that is Lore by Alexandra Bracken. And I really love this book to the point that I think I would have to really reread it. But I love Alexandra Bracken. So this is like a mythology themed story. This one's actually signed by Alex as well. And it basically follows this character named Lore, and it is sort of like a Hunger Games story meets the fates and like the myths and the gods. And I just really liked it. It was a very dark story. It did deal with a lot of grief, anxiety, depression. There was a romance at the heart of it. It was a standalone, and I very rarely read standalones. I think they don't get enough of praise because it's a self-contained story, and I really like that. I also thought Alex did mythology really, really well, and I am a big mythology fan. I'm a big Percy Jackson fan, and sometimes the mythology stories I have read are not that captivating or they're not that well crafted, but I think that Alex did a really good job as creating these myths and then inspired by something, like inspired by Greek mythology and stuff like that, and did a really, really good job. I think Lore was also a really, really fun main character. There was also a bunch of side characters that just were really, really fun, and it was a really, really fun read. I think this was like my first 5-star read of the year that I really, really loved, and I'm really bummed that we're not getting a new Alexandra Bracken book this year, but this one was really, really fun, and I'm definitely going to have to reread it, but it was a really, really engaging read, and one that didn't get enough love and attention, and I really enjoyed it. So if you're looking for a mythology read that is more adult, young adult, a little bit more intense and insane, I would definitely check out this one. The next book I'm going to chat about is actually a series conclusion, which I sometimes struggle with conclusions. I never read them. But I did read A Vow So Bold and Deadly by Bridget Kimmerer. This is the third book in her Once a Curse So Dark and Lonely, A Heart So Fierce and Broken series. And I thoroughly, really love this conclusion. I thought that this was a really fun conclusion because it followed all of the characters that you met in A Curse and A Heart. Like, you followed both of them and sort of wrapped up this story. The one thing I really did like about A Vow So Bold and Deadly is that it really built up and continued the myth of the beast throughout the whole series. Sometimes when you get like fairy tale retellings or like different couples, the myths sort of end, and I thought that Bridget did a really good job sort of making the myth of the beast kind of go through all the series, and I'm really intrigued to see what she writes next in this world. You'll see Bridget Kimmerer again on this list a little bit later for different books that I read by her as well. But I really like this. I thought the romance was really, really fun. Again, it was an elevated story, sort of like Lore. I think that these books, even though they are YA, dealt with a lot of heavier and harder topics, and I really enjoyed that. And that is why this book also made this list, and I'm really excited to see what Bridget Kimmerer writes next. I know we're also going back to the Cursebreaker world in a different series by Bridget, and I'm really excited for that. But these two books definitely made my list, and if you have not checked them out, I think you definitely should. It's also an Owl Crate book, I believe, and the next two are also Owl Crate books. Owl Crate has had some really good picks this year. I haven't loved all of their books, but these couple I really have. So next one we're going to talk about, everyone has talked about, Legendborn. This was also the moment when I was tagging books like crazy, which is just not something I think I'm ever going to really do ever, but it was a fun when I did it for those first couple of months. But I really like Legendborn. I'm a big Merlin girl. I've always really liked Merlin, and I really did like the story. I thought that it took the legend of Merlin and Arthur and the Arthurian legend and sort of turned it on its head a little bit. But you also sort of like Lore dealt with very hard topics in the story, and also like Amari and the Night Brothers, which I talked about in my other video, or I will talk about in a future video. It dealt with harder topics that really do plague and the Black community really does deal with. So I thought that this story did a lot in a book that I really enjoyed. It had a lot of elements I liked. I thought that it had a really, really fun main character. There was some subtle things that I struggled with like a little bit, but overall I really liked the story. I thought that the world was really fun. I really liked the main character. I like how they built the Arthurian legend world, and I like that it was secret society elements. I love that in a story, and I just really was fond of it. I thought it was very, very beautifully written. It also dealt with a lot of like grief over the death of her mother and the secrets that were sort of uncovered. It also had a unexpected magic twist, which I didn't see coming, but I really did like. So I'm really excited for Bloodmarked. I'm definitely going to hopefully read that soon whenever it comes out. But this is one that I really, really liked, and I know everyone has talked about it, but it's one that definitely captured my interest to a point, which is why it made this list. And the next book is another Owl Crate edition, and that is Sweet Bitter Magic by Adrienne Tooley. This is another witchy novel, and one that just really stood out to me. This follows two witches as they are forced to work together to solve a problem that they both have. It is sapphic, and I really liked it. I always say I want to read more like rich witch stories, and then I never do. This one I read in April, so it was not like during spooky season, but I really enjoyed it. I also just thought the story was really, really well crafted. I like both characters' point of views. I like how they were sort of forced to work together at the end of the day, and I like how their romance sort of developed. It was great. I definitely want to read more by Adrienne Tooley in the future. Sort of like lore, it was a nice standalone, which I very rarely read standalones, but this book was another one this year that really stood out to me, and that is why it's on this list. And I'm definitely looking forward to her second book that's coming out this year that has to do with music, but this one, for witches and sapphic story, I really liked. The book is one that won't be a shock to anyone, and that is Chain of Iron by Cassie Clare. I really am growing to adore the Shadowhunter series. Like, I am so upset that I have to wait until November to get Chain of Thorns, but this book was another one that really took me not even by surprise, but I just love Cassie Clare's writing, and I love these characters so much, and I think this book really cemented that, how much I loved it. This is the sequel to Chain of Gold. This follows Tessa and Will's, their generation's kids, and I just love the diversity in these books. Like, I really love it, and I think it's set in like a time period that you wouldn't necessarily expect a lot of diversity, but you get it. And Cassie Clare is always really good at like kicking you in the emotions and putting a couple in like a really like dangerous spot. And I just think in every single story, there's always a couple that you're just like, oh my goodness, what is going to happen? Why can't they be together? And in every story, it's always like an intense situation, and she does really good at amping up the pressure. I have really grown to really like Regency romances, and this really does read as a Regency romance to me with a lot of different couples, but then there is the paranormal elements that I really, really crave and love. It's great. It has a cast of characters that I adore. It has a plot that I really like. This is definitely going to be on my reread list probably over the summer, because I'll have a little bit more time and a lot more bike riding ability, so that's probably going to be when I'm going to reread this, but that's why it's on this list. And if you have not checked out the series, I think you definitely should. I do recommend you maybe pick up the Infernal Devices series first before you start this one, because you might be a little bit confused, but this is definitely becoming one of my favorite series that I've read by her. Only slightly, because I am definitely a City of Bones person. Like, I love that series because it has some of my favorite characters, but these characters are becoming a really, really close second, and I'm really excited to see how this series concludes and then what she works on next. I'm good at keeping the books I really like. So another one that I wound up keeping was Defy the Night by Bridget Kimmerer. This was a one that just, again, was a book that I really liked. It's so funny sometimes how fate works. I have loved Bridget Kimmerer's writing. I've loved her contemporary. I love her fantasy stuff. This book does deal with a pandemic, and I remember like going to see Bridget Kimmerer, and like she talked about it at BookCon, no, not BookCon, New York City Comic-Con, she talked about it, and the pandemic was pre-planned, like she had done this before, but it's just such fate, how fate works. But you basically follow these two characters. You follow Tessa and her best friend Wes as they sort of work together to save this town from a pandemic. And Wes's is not exactly who Tessa thinks he is, and they are sort of forced together to work, and a rebellion is sort of struck. And I love this story. I love books about friends to more. That's one of my favorite tropes, and I definitely would argue this is what that is. There's also mistaken identity in here. There is a lot of anxiety in this story and a lot of tension. And some of the books I read in the later half of the year, they lacked a lot of that tension. They were like standalones and, starting books in a series, and I didn't feel the tension. Defy the Night definitely had a lot of tension, and I just really love Tessa and Wes as characters. You got both of their point of views, and I think for this story and specifically, it was like really important that you got both their point of views. But I loved it. This cover is so pretty, and that is why it is on this list. I will definitely be checking out book 2 whenever it comes out, but definitely worth a read, and another Bridget Kimmerer world to fall into. I'm really excited to see what she works on next. And then the last physical book we're going to chat about is another Owl Crate pick, and that is This Poison Heart by Caitlin Barron. This is a Secret Garden retelling, and oh my goodness, I love this. I actually didn't even read this copy, but the cover is so pretty. I read mine on like an e-arc, I think. But I love this book. So you basically follow this girl named Bree or Breezy, and she lives with her two moms in New York City. They run a flower shop, but when her aunt passes away, she is bequeathed this mansion where she starts to realize her power she's been hiding for her whole life might be connected to her family, and she sort of has to work with a couple of different characters to sort of uncover what's going on. Secret Garden is definitely one of my favorite fairy tale stories, only followed by A Little Princess, but I really like the story like quite a bit. It is also sapphic, like Sweet Bitter Magic by Adrienne Tooley, which again I've really been enjoying this year, just reading like different stories and different life experiences. I love books that are sort of set in New York City. This one's set in upstate, where I went to school in upstate like for many, many years. I really like this. I thought there was a nice mystery at the heart of it. It also reminded me a little bit of The Secret Garden, which again is a myth that I really have enjoyed. It's a movie that I loved when I was little. And I just, again, sort of like Legendborn, I love that she took this story and sort of created a whole new myth. And I like that. And she sort of had an African-American character at the lead, and sort of like Amari the Night Barge and Legendborn. It really did showcase a different experience, and I think it was such a well-crafted story. I really want to go back and read Cinderella as a Dad, because I think I will like that equally as much. But it was really, really fun, and I'm excited to see what comes next in this series or duology. So the last couple books I don't have physical copies of. I either borrowed them, gave them to friends, or donated them for some reason. So let's get into it. The first book we're going to chat about is Nature of Witches by Rachel Griffins. Here is a photo. Standalone read, and I really love this. Again, this is another witchy read that again I really, really liked. But you basically follow this girl named Clara, and this is a witchy story that is closely connected to climate change. And in this world, people are born witches, and you're either born, every witch is born and they're connected to a certain season. And if you have seasonal magic, it allows that witch to help with climate issues in that time period. But because climate change is becoming so popular, climate events are happening in seasons where the witches are not as powerful, and it's causing some climate issues. Then you have Clara, who is a Everwitch, which means she changes with the seasons, and she is incredibly powerful, but she can't focus her magic, and it has led to the death of many people in her life. Whenever she gets emotionally invested in you, her magic sort of backfires and is like really extreme. And she starts this book in a really, really despondent state. Like, she's very isolated. She doesn't know how to relate to people, and she's really dealing with a lot. This book is a very big portrait of grief. You have to really be prepared when you read the story, because I know a lot of the reviews I was reading said that they didn't really like Clara and they thought that she was annoying. I did not see her as annoying. I found her just dealing with a lot, and I found that to be very, very refreshing. She was not a character that, like, you necessarily wanted to be in her head, but at the end of the story, I think I grew to love her. I also like that it was a very fluid story. I'll say that. There was a lot of changes that Clara went through, like, with all of the seasons, and it was very reflective. This book also takes place over, like, the course of a year, so every season. It reminded me a little bit of the structure of maybe this time BKC West, because it also was very, very seasonally specific. I really like that there's also, like, a romance throughout the whole story, and it does talk a lot about climate change, and I really like that because I think it handled that topically really interestingly, and I don't think I've ever really read a book like that before, but it was one that I really liked, and I definitely want to read more by this author in the future, and it was just a book that stood out to me, and that's why it's on this list. And then the next book we're going to talk about is one of my last books of the year, and that is A Gathering of Shadows by B.E. Schwab. When I was in Disney, I read this like that last week. So it's not the exact last book I read, but it's pretty close. This again was one of my 5-star read predictions, and I was like putting off reading this book because I felt like I probably needed to reread A Darker Shade of Magic, which I had not done. But I'm pleased to report I really liked this story. It was very different from the first book. The first book was very much more of like a thief story and like something was stolen. This book is more of a magical competition, and I loved it. I also like that Kel and Laya were in very different locations, and I think that that really enhanced the story for me, because in the first book they were really close together and it was a very, very mirror story. This story, for most of the book, they were very, very separate, but the competition became a really important part. Also, the relationship between Kel and his brother was very, very different. The political intrigue sort of kicked up a notch. There was the subplot that I was really engaged in and really concerned about. I actually really want to buy Conjuring Light now and just tackle the rest of the series soon. I really love this, and I don't know why it took me so long to read it. Probably because I'm just really, really bad at reading sequels. I definitely got better. Check out my new season video that's coming out soon. That will be in a couple of days, where I'm like kind of wrapping up all my series and then gonna pick 5 to focus on for 2022. Which we're currently in, but I really, really enjoyed this book, and that is why it's made the list. And then the last book I'm going to talk about is another V.E. Schwab book, and that is The Invisible Light of Addie LaRue. Here is a photo. To make the list because I found it so interesting, and I just love the writing style of the story. I thought it was very, very fascinating. Basically, you follow this character named Addie, and she, when she's in the 1700s, makes a deal with the devil so that she doesn't have to marry this man. But there are a couple of catches. Once she makes this deal, once she passes out of sight of somebody, they don't remember her. And this happens for decades on decades on decades. And she basically, like, ageless. She doesn't age, and she's going to live forever unless she kind of, you know, calls in her bet with this devil, and he kind of takes her soul and reaps her soul. And one day she meets a young boy in New York City, and he can remember her, and it is their story. I will admit the story did not go the way that I thought it was going to go, and I was okay with that. At the end, it was very emotional. It sort of tugged at my heartstrings. I mentioned this in my reading blog. I don't know when the reading blog's going to go up. I didn't feel like there was like enough tension in this story, but that's okay. I think that was sort of the point. I think you're just literally following Addie through her life. You're also seeing Henry through his life. And I thought it was a very interesting story to kind of put. It was very, very lyrical, very, very, like, interesting. I really did like Addie as a character. I really liked Henry as a character. And it was just a very interesting concept that I really, really liked. I'm really excited to read more by V.E. Schwab in the future. She's definitely one of my focus authors for 2022. Again, see my goal video. I do talk about that. But I really, really did like this book. So those are my top 10, maybe 11 young adult fantasy books that really stood out to me in 2021. And I'm really excited to see what books I pick up in 2022 and see what's on this list at the end of the year. But I'll talk to you guys for my next BookMas video. Bye, friends.